My name's William Findlay from Carleton University, and today I'll be presenting our paper characterizing the adoption of Security.txt files and their applications to vulnerability notification. So just some brief context behind this work. It was largely inspired by a paper called You've Got Vulnerability by Lee et al. From Usenix 2016. And in that paper, they investigated things like who is abuse contacts and national certs as potential points of contact for vulnerability notification campaigns. And what we thought is, what about Security.txt, which is a fairly young draft RFC, and basically the point of it is to allow websites to define a canonical way for their security contacts. And could this be useful for vulnerability notifications? And so our goal there was to conduct a measurement study to gauge this utility. And interestingly, some folks from the above paper conducted a similar study in parallel to our work. So that offers some interesting opportunities to compare methodologies and results. So just to briefly highlight our contributions, firstly, we designed and open-sourced a novel web crawler and a Security.txt parsing library in Rust. Second, we used these two artifacts to conduct a large-scale study of Security.txt's adoption in the top 1 million domains according to the Tranco list. And thirdly, we presented a discussion and analysis of Security.txt's utility for vulnerability notifications based on the above findings. So in particular, we had 4 major research questions here. First of which was to measure adoption. So to what extent are various versions of the RFC currently being adopted among major stakeholders? Second was to measure consistency. How consistent are Security.txt deployments, and what factors impact their consistency? And the third was to gauge utility for vulnerability notifications. So how viable would current or previous RFC versions be for such a large-scale notification campaign? And finally, we wanted to identify any barriers that might exist that would limit the adoption of Security.txt and its utility for vulnerability notifications. So before we proceed with methodology, I wanted to briefly highlight the Security.txt spec. So this is an example of a Security.txt file that would be fully compliant with the latest RFC version 12. And what I've done here is I've highlighted the required fields in blue. So you see we require that at least one contact field is specified, and that files specify what expiry date they have. Comments are optional and can be provided with these hashtags in front of the line here. And all these other different fields are optional and are used to provide some additional information and context behind the file. And finally, we have this optional clear text PGP signature, which kind of wraps the message and provides some authentication guarantees. So in this research, we produced 2 major artifacts. First was SecMap, which is a massively parallel Security.txt mapper that crawls the web for valid Security.txt files, and Sec.txt.rs, which is an open source Security.txt parsing library for Rust. So SecMap is written in Rust as well, and it uses this Sec.txt.rs under the hood to parse and validate files. But our hope is that the open source library would also be useful for others, maybe conducting similar studies, or working with Security.txt in some other way. I also wanted to note that some other Rust crates do already exist for parsing Security.txt, but they weren't really fit for our purpose since they're either outdated, incomplete, or don't handle multiple RFC versions, which was a major goal of our research. So in the end, the final version of SecMap was able to iterate over the entire top 1 million domains in about 2 hours, which is just over 2 million requests in total, or 1 million requests per hour. And we achieved this using a 10-second timeout on dead URLs and 512 concurrent connections at a time. So here's a brief overview of the architecture behind our work. So basically we have SecMap, which ingests the top 1 million domains from the Tranco list, and then mutates them using a crawl strategy. So there are 2 possible locations where a valid Security.txt file can exist. It's one of these 2 paths that you can see here. And basically we send 1 request per possible location to every domain. These requests then head over to crawler threads where they go out to the wider internet, and we receive replies back, which are then parsed by Sec.txt.rs. That information is then encoded into a Rust data structure along with any metadata and the raw text of the parsed Security.txt file. And then we send that over to MongoDB, which we could then forward to our data analysis pipeline. So a major goal here was to handle different RFC versions, and to characterize these different versions, our parser basically should support all different major RFCs. And it turns out there are 6 breaking RFC versions out of the 12 total. And what I mean by breaking here is basically any characteristic that would preclude a prior version. So in order, these are RFC 12 changes the date format from RFC 5322 format to ISO 8601. RFC 11 was the last version where you could use an RFC 5322 date. RFC 9 was the last version where the expiry date field was considered optional. After that, it was mandatory. RFC 5 was the last version where HTTP links are allowed instead of HTTPS. RFC 4 was the last version with the signature field instead of clear text PGP. And RFC 2 was the last version with inferred URL schemes for email or telephone. So here's a brief summary of the different types of responses we got for issuing requests. As you can see, the percentage of valid files that we ended up finding is very small. Only 0.286% of responses returned a valid file. The rest of potentially valid responses resulted in a parse error, so that's about 0.13% of total responses. 10% of responses were non-plain text, which we just threw out right away. And then a significant majority of them were either HTTP client errors, protocol errors, or request errors. Zooming in a little bit here on parsing errors, I'd like to first note that we filtered all the invalid responses before parsing happens. So this would include things like non-plain text responses. So you could think of a parse error as representing a candidate file that failed parsing. So in other words, an invalid Security.txt file. Looking at the data, we found that 900 of the files are due to missing contacts, which is arguably pretty bad since the contact field is kind of the whole point. And it's not immediately clear why stakeholders chose to exclude this field, but some potential reasons might include worrying about being contacted in an automated way by malicious actors, for example. Another 1,400 files, or about 54% of parse errors, contain lines without any fields. And often this would be a line that should have been a comment, but did not begin with a hashtag. So that's something to bear in mind when you're writing these kinds of parsers. And we also found, after some manual inspection, that some files just totally ignored the spec altogether and kind of put whatever they wanted in there. So in total, we found 4,864 of the top 1 million domains have a valid file. So that's either with one response returning a valid file or 2 responses. And what that means is that 99.51% of the top 1 million domains are either invalid or missing a Security.txt file. We found that 50% of all valid files are found in the top 241,000 sites. So there is some skew towards the top sites being more likely to have a Security.txt file. And also we note that not all top ranking sites have one, for example, Twitter, but many do. So for example, Facebook and Google both had one. We also note a very wide range of RFC compliance, ranging all the way from RFC 12 to RFC 2. And interestingly, 48% of files were found to belong to RFC 9. And this is mostly due to missing expiry dates. Expiry dates themselves tend to range from a few days to several decades, and in some cases, we did find files that had been left to expire. In total, 4,100 files, or 84.2% of all valid files, had at least one email contact, which is fairly promising for an automated vulnerability notification campaign, because you can imagine email would be the primary point of contact there. HTTPS contacts were also fairly common at around 34%, and telephone contacts were very rare. We only found 35 cases in total. Most files, about 40%, did not define any contact language. Of those that did define a contact language, English was the most popular at around 32%. We found 310 files, or 6.37%, provided a valid PGP signature with a key, which is fairly promising for secure communication with stakeholders. We also found 2,477 who-is abuse contacts in domains with valid files, but note that none of the abuse contact domains matched a Security.txt contact, which implies that who-is abuse contacts are likely not a good choice for communicating vulnerabilities. So Security.txt also provisions something called extension fields, which basically allows you to define a field in your file that is not part of the official spec. And the idea is that it's supposed to make the files more flexible. But what we ended up finding after some manual inspection is that a lot of these are due to things like spelling errors for what otherwise would be official fields. We also found that 16% of extension fields are labeled with something other than policy, but refer to a security policy. So this would be an example of a parser that might miss an important field. We also found that 14% were labeled with open bug bounty, which basically is a program for coordinating bug bounty programs with organizations. And there's enough examples of this that this might end up just becoming part of a future spec. But these also probably could have just been labeled with a policy field. So in terms of viability, many Security.txt files appear viable for vulnerability notifications. Remember, we had about 4,100 domains with email contacts. Many HTTPS contacts are HackerOne, which could also be automated. However, the adoption rate is still very low, so only about 0.49% of the top 1 million domains. In terms of robustness, our parser found lots of mistakes in the wild, with many of these mistakes being hidden behind extension fields. A lot of this is due to sources of ambiguity in the spec, so for example, regional spelling differences, or the fact that preferred languages is just one field, whereas other fields are allowed to be repeated. There's also no guidelines about how to choose an expiry date, so what happens is files tend to get outdated very quickly, and others are just left to expire. In terms of future directions, we hope to eventually drive a notification campaign with SecMap and Sec.txt.rs, and the goal would be to try to replicate the methodology from the You've Got Vulnerability paper and see how Security.txt actually compares to these other methods. Another eventual goal is to write a Security.txt linter using the Sec.txt.rs library to help validate files. And there's potential for automatic notification of problems in a Security.txt file in the future, which could be useful. And finally, we'd like to eventually run a longitudinal study which could measure things like version churn, for example. And that's it. Thank you.